Brace yourself, you say to your face in the mirror. You can do this. You've got this. We've all said this to ourselves at one time or another, right? In this week's podcast in our worship series, This American Life, we hear from an 8-year-old about to jump off the high diving board, a minister getting ready to preach his first sermon, a woman about to have her first baby, a couple about to have sex for the first time, a woman finally voicing, "I want a divorce," a man preparing to deliver his mother's eulogy. Sometimes we do it. We shake off our fear, we brace ourselves, and we do what we have been scared to do. And sometimes we say to the God of diving, "Not today," and we avoid the leap or the confrontation or the truth-telling. Do you know that feeling in your gut that arises when you're uncomfortable with what's going on around you and you want to speak up and do something, but you're trying to summon the courage to do so? Yeah. Malcolm Rosenthal found himself with that feeling one evening while out for drinks with his coworkers. Isn't that so often where that feeling begins? Malcolm is a behavioral ecologist whose research focuses on the wolf spider, which he refers to as cute, like a puppy. Sitting around that table that evening were several researchers from the animal behavior department, some from the spider lab, some from the cricket lab, some from the bird lab. One bemoaned the fact that they had just had a paper rejected by a prominent journal. Another mentioned casually that it was probably because it's harder to get things published when you work with invertebrates. A bird researcher took great offense at this suggestion. That's ridiculous. And it turned into a heated argument about whether this was true, whether there was a bias against invertebrates in the world of animal behavior research. Malcolm refers to this as the vertebrate divide. People who study spineless creatures like worms, beetles, and mollusks feel marginalized within the animal behavior community. People who study animals with spines like finches, chimpanzees, dolphins, and humans are the golden children, they say. He left the bar that evening infuriated. He couldn't let go of that argument with the bird scientist. So he decided to do something about it. One day, at a training for work, he was so bored that he started downloading papers from the journal Animal Behavior's website, categorizing them by animal. At the end of 3 hours, he had been through 400 papers. He enlisted the help of his wife, Jackie, and a few undergrads to help complete the project, intent on answering the question, does research about birds and other vertebrates get published more than research like his own? The answer, of course, was yes. Birds and mammals make up less than 0.1% of all species, and they make up half of all published papers in the last 50 years. In addition to the data that his study revealed, it opened his eyes to the fact that the world is so much bigger than we know. If you think you know the world because you've studied hundreds and hundreds of birds or mammals, maybe you don't know the world, he said. We've only been looking at a tiny sliver and we thought it was the whole world. Maybe things are so out of whack that we're missing things and we don't even know what we're missing. Malcolm figured that if he could just present the facts to his colleagues, that they too would have the same realization that he did and would start paying attention to the bias in their field. And so he presented the numbers at the annual conference of the Animal Behavior Society, where all the prominent people in the field gather each year. He felt like he was speaking truth to power, the tame science version, that is. And it turned into the most raucous animal behavior panel he had ever experienced. The room was packed with people sitting, standing, and spilling out the doors. People stood up in the middle of his talk and yelled, "Hell yeah!" and cheered, and there were fist pumps. This was at a conference where most of the time you're lucky to get some tame, sad applause at the end of your talk. He was flying high for a while after his talk, basking in the enthusiasm and praise from his colleagues, proud of himself for saying what needed to be said, and fired up about leading the resistance for the ignored creatures of the world, the boneless, the slimy, and the microscopic. But then he realized everyone who came up to him and cheered him on was an invertebrate researcher or a spider researcher. The bird and mammal people hadn't been at the talk. He hadn't spoken truth to power because the power decided not to show up. He had been, as they say, preaching to the choir. But he persisted. He finally got his findings in front of the vertebrate majority when his paper was accepted for publication. But the peer reviews were astoundingly polarized, and his research got twisted into an argument about affirmative action and quotas. The vertebrate scientists insisted, we are under attack. The journals only take the best research, and it just so happens that the bird research is the best. Does this sound familiar? Malcolm's attempt to challenge his colleagues, to talk about diversity, to widen their view of the animal world, and to point out an awkward truth about bias within their field of study, got turned into the worst kind of panel discussion, an awkward conversation that didn't go very well, and in the end, nothing changed. Does that sound familiar to anyone? The thing is, Malcolm learned some painful lessons about his fellow humans by examining how humans study the animal world. If you're trying to convince a bunch of humans about a difficult truth, about something that challenges their livelihood and perspective on the world, just laying out the facts is probably not going to be effective. Malcolm failed to create the same experience that he'd had in his research of having his eyes and his mind and his heart opened to the vastness of the animal world. And he failed to attend to the human and emotional dynamics of change. This requires a particular kind of courage, courage with vulnerability. Now, the story in the podcast about Malcolm Rosenthal reminded me of another story that I once heard about Winston Churchill. Churchill faced one of the most difficult diplomatic challenges of his life in a somewhat unexpected setting, an elegant dinner party. He was approached by the distraught hostess who had observed one of her guests pocketing one of her best silver salt and pepper shaker sets. And the hostess discreetly asked Churchill if he might think of some way to get back her property without causing a big scene. So, Winston Churchill went to the other end of the dining table and pocketed the other set of silver shakers. He sidled up to the thief and opened his pocket just wide enough for the man to see the shakers inside and whispered, "I think they've seen us. We'd better put them back." What a brilliant and humble partnership, though. Churchill knew that when trying to deliver a difficult or challenging or prophetic message, your words are more often heard when you stand side by side with people in the dilemma with them. It requires courage with vulnerability. Courage with vulnerability is different than courage with hubris. We've all probably been guilty of courage with hubris at one time or another, thinking that our way or our perspective was obviously the right way and that we just needed to convince others of the truth, just lay out the facts. But if we are to respond to the world and the times we live in, and if we are to truly embody our Unitarian Universalist faith and values, we cannot let our courage be fueled by hubris. Summoning courage, getting a spine, growing a backbone must not mean hardening ourselves to the creatures that are around us. Courage must be fueled by humility, carried out with vulnerability, and sustained by core strength. Now, when I say core strength, I'm not talking about the stability of your spine or the strength of your back and abdominal muscles. I'm talking about your spiritual core, the center of who you are. Just as the spine provides our vertebrate bodies with strength and support, our spiritual core, too, provides us with strength and dignity. Now, I've learned that occupational therapy for people needing help with handwriting focuses on core strength, because how we hold our bodies impacts so much, including the legibility of our writing. Spiritual practice, too, helps us to stabilize our core for the twists and turns and the ups and downs of life, and to navigate them with grace. In today's reading that you heard from Reverend TJ, written by Roshi Joan Halifax, we heard about the Buddhist concept of strong back, soft front. It's a way of being in the world that allows for both strength and courage, as well as flexibility and tenderness. If we develop a spine that's flexible but sturdy, she says, then we can risk having a front that's soft and open. And the place where these two meet is our spiritual core, the center from which courage and compassion emerge. A strong spiritual core comes from knowing who we are and what's important to us. It's nurtured by both the challenges we face and by being grounded and safe and loved in a family or a community or a church. I know for me, church helps me build my spiritual core by being a place where I feel a sense of belonging, where we feel a sense of belonging, and where we're challenged to open our minds and hearts at the same time. A place where we approach others with humility and vulnerability, knowing that having a soft front is not a weakness. It's part of our strength. Love is the doctrine of our church, and it is our collective spiritual core. It inspires us to do good work in the world, to speak truth to power, and to live with a strong back and a soft front. Church also reminds us that the world and the universe, the divine, all of it is so much bigger than us. There are those millions of invertebrate species, known and unknown. But also, the hymn we sang right before the sermon, "There's a wideness in your mercy," is basically saying, stop falling into the trap of limiting God. The divine, the universe, creation are so much wider than we know. Love is without limits, moving through all creation more abundantly than we humans can begin to conceive. And so we gather here to embrace and embody a piece of that love, to the end that all souls shall grow in harmony with the divine. So get a spine, friends, but don't lose your softness, tenderness, compassion, or love. These are our strengths and the foundation of our courage. May it always be so. Amen. Now let's sing. Oh.